I think we are ready to begin. It is hard to believe that this is the last class. And for some, this is the last class in one's matriculation through this beloved institution, Harvard, and all of its faults and foibles and all of its strengths and virtues. I do want to acknowledge our dear brother Peter, who's been magnificent. This is his last class at Harvard Law. And let's give it up for him, even before he has worked for many years with Brother Roberto, Professor Unger, and I've been blessed to work with him as well, and he is magnificent. We have an announcement. We've got a freedom fighter in the house, and our dear sister is going to say a brief word about him.
Brought to life some of his wooden scrolls that he had designed and hidden while he was in prison in Kentucky. And at the same time, he was working on a short film about his experience there, including living through a prison riot and losing a lot of opportunity to get a college degree, etc., through that experience. He's showing his short film and displaying his art tonight at 5 p.m. at the Winthrop House in the Junior Common Room. It's one of the undergraduate houses. And I'm really delighted to say that some of the art you'll see and the film that you would see, it's 15 minutes, helped him get a full scholarship to both NYU and USC Film School, which I think is actually probably harder than getting into Harvard. So he's a great storyteller who's actually been on the inside, and that's rare these days, and so I hope you'll join us at 5 p.m. in the Winthrop House. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Any other announcements? Any other? Yes, my dear brother.
For any grad students in the house, you have until 8 p.m. to vote for reunion. You can go to Queenshead, Memorial Hall, just a couple blocks away.
It looks like it's proceeding now, huh? No, indeed, indeed. I was blessed to do a video for young brothers and sisters trying to come together, engage in a fair and just collective bargaining. There's such massive exploitation of those in the lower rungs of the academy, lecturers, adjunct professors, and so forth and so on. And we've got to be very honest and candid about their plight and predicament and make sure they're treated with dignity and respect. But let's plunge right in. We told you last week that we look forward to not so much your questions, but your propositions and your proposals, both in the papers that you're working on, but also responding to what we have tried to put forward. We've been very clear from the very beginning that we have absolutely no monopoly on truth-telling. We think we're right. We're not relativists. But we know we're fallible. We're open to answerability, responsibility, and accountability. And we wanted to use this last section, given that you had now a number of weeks. I hope you're coming along on your papers. How does it look? Are you coming along your papers, or are you waiting for the last minute? You doing? Waiting for the last minute? Oh, all right. But I can tell the depth of your commitment and your talent is such. You don't have to worry, but everybody else might have a challenge. I'm telling you, absolutely. But as you recall now, we tried to highlight the intimate relation between interpretation and direction. And we've had a variety of different interpretations of the U.S. experience. We talked about the psychic, the cultural, the political, the economic. We began with the inimitable Alexis de Tocqueville, Nothing Like It in the History of the American Empire, written by that French aristocrat, trying to make sense of the specificity and singularity of the social experiment and experience called the USA and all of its imperial expansion on the one hand, but also in terms of those individuals who made their way here some of whom reach some very high levels of integrity, honesty, and decency, and some of whom reach high levels of greed, avarice, hatred, and contempt. Namely, they're part of the human race like anybody else. We talked about the various forms of American exceptionalism. Professor Unger talked about exceptionalism, capital E, exceptionalism, small e, and that small e had to do with the outlier of the 11 different distinctive characteristics and features that he highlighted. But he always wanted to connect it, and we both always wanted to connect it to our diagnosis of the present and the prognosis, always connecting it to alternatives, trying to shatter the truncated discussion that goes on between either neoconservatives or more and more authoritarian populists and neo-fascists on the right and the more milquetoast, spineless neoliberals in the center. Not a whole lot of discussion about some of the other voices not making themselves heard enough to try to keep track of the suffering and doings of our fellow citizens, no matter what color, no matter what gender, sexual orientation. We're talking about fellow human beings and fellow citizens trying to keep alive the best of this very fragile, precious experiment in democracy that is in profound trouble. What a bleak moment we live in. So in that sense, it's an ideal time for you to write a paper on American democracy. So what are some of your proposals? What are some of your propositions? Let's think out loud, as it were, in light of the provocations that you all have had access to in the last number of weeks of Brother Roberto and myself, Professor Unger and myself. Do not hesitate. I know you've come prepared with some of your thoughts and propositions and proposals. Brother Mann, did you want to jump right in? Uh-huh. So at the core of your proposal, your fundamental thesis would be the connection between foreign and domestic policies, the ways in which America must be viewed as one nation among other nations. And then you're going to generate some real programmatic... But I thought we'd had some discussions about imperialism and America as empire, which has to do with America's relation to other nations. You know, no, it wasn't extensive enough, but it wasn't. None of the subject matter was extensive enough, though. Just in the few weeks that we have, though, absolutely. But I applaud your concern about trying to have a more global and international perspective on these things. Very, very much so. Very much so. I mean, one of the things you want to keep in mind, all of us, is that you want to think in your mind what would be the strongest arguments against your claim so that you can disarm those critiques to the best of your ability. So you're both raising your voices, exercising creative imagination, but conceiving of what would the strongest critics have to say. You then respond to those critics that makes your argument even stronger. You know, when Nietzsche used to say we're only as strong as our critics, that dialogical and dialectical quality of education that Professor Unger has been talking about over the weeks, and also at work in your papers. I thought I saw another hand somewhere. Was that your hand, my dear sister? And you raise your voice so we can hear the whole way. And when you say remaining more protected, it's about exposing yourself too much to. And the particular groups you had in mind would be what? You wouldn't want a cabin there. I see. Okay. Okay. All righty. All righty. Yes. How you doing? And that crucial distinction between individuality and individualism, because that claim of the extraordinariness of ordinary people, if they muster the right kind of courage and commitment to be willing to serve and sacrifice, reinforces the individuality, but holds at arm's length an atomized, narrow, rapacious, rugged individualism that tends to reinforce a narcissism, a hedonism, to make it difficult for public life to have real content and character. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And others, please don't hesitate to jump in, even as we respond to. Yes? Wonderful.
And discovering that we kind of systematically pull the arts out of schools throughout the nation. We do not use
what kind of reception do you think you have or will receive in trying to talk about arts as constitutive rather than additive with regard to?
I can give you one example,
Mm-hmm.
a small example. One of the things that Murray says in Real Education, he uses this example of how if you take a high school class full of seniors, the students on the 20 percentile readers, he says, will understand nothing of Macbeth, and the 90 percenters will understand Macbeth. And when I read that, I just really had steam coming out. I'm sitting with one of my interviewers, a former Newark high school teacher.
Mm-hmm. Salute you.
Steam coming out of my ear because I have taught students who read at maybe a fifth grade reading level Macbeth in a senior high school class, and I've also taught students in the same class who wound up at Columbia and Yale and Air Force Academy, and they all understood Macbeth. So I felt that there was something as a poet that I was using in the classroom to make that happen that isn't getting used on a wide-scale basis. So, and I'm talking too much about my own experience, but I guess what I'm trying to say is I really, this whole course, how you think about education is completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm trying to encapsulate that.
Mm-hmm. And no need to apologize about speaking about your own proposal, your own proposition based in your own experience in that regard. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I'm so glad to see you lift up the name of Muriel Rukeyser. Oh, wow. She's right there, Sarah Lawrence, for 45 years, teaching Alice Walker and Adrienne Rich. I mean, one of the distinctive features of a decadent civilization is when you have exemplars of the highest levels of excellence, moral, intellectual, spiritual excellence, who are completely overlooked, who are completely pushed to the peripheral and the margins, you see. Well, her Life of Poetry of 1949 is one of the great works. In some ways, it builds on Walt Whitman's Democratic Vistas, which is also one of the great prophetic statements about the possibilities of interpretation and direction of where America is going in the 1870s for Walt Whitman, and she is a Whitman-esque figure in the 20th century. And the very fact that she's not attended to in our curriculum and popular discourse and so forth says something about where you're going. It's like somebody saying, oh, okay, I really want to learn how to play piano, and don't say a word about Art Tatum, don't say a word about Valdemar Horowitz, but only talk about Liberace. Liberace, God bless him, glitz, blitz. Horowitz, no language to describe. Art Tatum, no language to describe. Mary Lou Williams, no language to describe. But dish out Liberace and think somehow you're going to become a great piano player. There's a real sense in that being a kind of model for so much of contemporary public discourse, contemporary education, including even education here at Harvard. Things are so specialized, compartmentalized, atomized, that you don't get a sense of what the connections are, what the relations are, and who the great exemplars are of excellence. You see? I mean, I don't want to go on and on, but I appreciate the your provocation, intervention. Yes, my brother. And this is tied to a vision so that the direction is headed towards a fulfillment of a larger vision of fundamental transformation, but still a step-by-step, stage-by-stage process. So is that fair?
Yeah, definitely. It has to be attached to a reconstructionist vision of how we're going to address poverty in this country that doesn't disconnect poverty and really.
Right.
So if I could comment about that, something to reflect on with regard to this idea. What you describe is what is often labeled a targeting strategy, which you single out the groups in greatest need, and you design the emancipatory policy for those groups. Now, there is a practical objection to this strategy, which has been paramount in the ideas of the European Social Democrats, and was also paramount in Franklin Roosevelt's social programs in the New Deal, which was the conception that for a program of social inclusion and economic empowerment to be robust against downswings of the economic cycle or changes in the temporary political majority, it must be universalizing, and it must include the broad mass of working people in the country. Oh, I'm sorry. It must include the broad majority of working class people. If it is narrowly targeted, what is likely to happen, according to historical experience, is that in downswings of the economic cycle then, or in changes of the political majorities, it will be turned off. So this isn't a definitive objection to the targeting approach, but it introduces a very important complication, which somehow you have to design the program so that it combines these differential criteria with an openness to the majority. It doesn't divide up the progressive working class constituency that you need as a base into particular groups that then are, as it were, special interests. And that's not an impossible problem to solve, but it is an instigation to design, to institutional design, how you can combine the inclusive universalism with this element of differentiation that practical circumstance requires.
You'll be wrestling with this in your paper, though, right? Yeah, that's good, that's good. I mean, I think one of the sadder features of the past 10 years was that there were few of us who did push for poverty-centered programs under the neoliberal president, my dear brother Barack Obama, turned his back. Did talk about targeting, especially the new Jim Crow, but also black communities, brown communities. Didn't want to touch it because rising tide escalates, elevates all boats, as he used to say. So you think, my God, with a black president, if any time, this is the moment to hit poverty, in the name and the legacy of Martin King, to target in such a way that you have a universal vision, but you recognize these are the ones who are being hurt the most. Black Attorney General, Black Homeland Security. Wouldn't say a mumbling word about it. Now you get authoritarian populists, now you get neo-fascist stirrings, and you get poor people's movement. And the irony is, some of them, not William Barber, but some of the folk who are part of the poor people's movement are the same folk who said, don't say a word about poverty under the neoliberal black president because it embarrasses him. And yet poor people were undergoing unbelievable suffering. The poverty rates were going up. 1 out of 2 of black children and brown children under 6 living in poverty, 50%. And you got a black president can't say a mumbling word. And you got a black professional class who's protecting him as if they're turning their backs on the black poor and the brown poor. So that's just something to keep in mind in terms of moral consistency. So you're not going to have any kind of authority in a democracy if you can't have moral consistency, whatever the situation or whoever's in office.
So one of the recurrent themes in the course has been the relation of interests and ideals to institutions and practices,
right.
and the vital importance of institutional innovation. So take this problem that you mentioned as an example. And so we have a practical goal of accommodating the need for differentiation while insisting on a universal principle.
Right.
An example that came up at one point in our discussions in the course. You can have as a universal principle the idea that if there is some group that finds itself imprisoned in a circumstance of disempowerment or disadvantage, from which it is unable to escape by the forms of collective political and economic action that are available to it, there must be some power in the state that allows the state to come to the rescue of that group and to provide it with the equipment to escape. Now then we have a problem in the organization of the government. And here comes then the example of the connection between the practical goal and the agenda of institutional redesign. There is no branch of the tripartite government, the three branches of judiciary, legislature, and executive, that is designed, equipped, and financed to do work that is at the same time structural and localized. So the legislature makes the laws, the structure, but not in a localized fashion. It operates by universalizing techniques. The executive is not supposed to act structurally. It acts in a localized fashion, but without changing the institutions. And the judiciary recognizes rights and settles disputes among parties against the background of the laws that it, the judiciary, does not make. So there's no branch of the government that is equipped and intended to do this work that is at the same time structural and localized. So what you would need in the future is to design such a branch. Designed just for that work and financed for it. And then you'd have to say how it would be selected, either elected directly or co-selected by the other branches of government and so forth. But what happens in the short term? What happens in the short term before you have this change in the government is that one of the existing branches has to assume this work incongruously. Now, what has happened, now in principle, it could be any three of them. But what's happened as a matter of fact in the United States is that the branch that has come closest to doing this work has been the judiciary, especially the federal judiciary, acting through what in law we call the structural injunctions or complex enforcement. So, for example, they take over a prison system or a school system or a set of mental hospitals, which are seen as being in contradiction to the ideals of the law. They intervene in that local system. They take it over temporarily. They fix it in some way, and then they're supposed to return it fixed. But because the judges are unelected and relatively powerless, they act only with regard to these peripheral institutions, like prisons or insane asylums or local school systems, not with respect to the central institutions of the society. So you could say this is just a trial run. It's a foretaste. And then there have to be a second stage in which you would actually create the branch of the government that could do this work more deeply and on a larger scale. Then we hit up against this constraint in American politics and American political culture of the cult of the Constitution. So the Americans changed the Constitution by pretending that it means something different, rather than by changing it overtly. And it's easier to do that with respect to principles like due process or equal protection than with respect to the setup of the government. And in this case, it has to be with respect to the setup of the government. So what I'm trying to illustrate by this example, which goes back to many of the arguments in the course, is that once you begin to think in this way, everything is structural. That all of our fundamental goals have to do with institutional innovation, and then with the revision of our understanding of ideals and interests in the light of institutional innovation. If we could teach ourselves to think and to act in that way, we would have a tremendous instrument of transformation.
I mean, another way for me of putting this is, we've talked about this in the class, it's just amazing how innovative and creative and courageous our fellow citizens at the top can be when it comes to preserving their status, power, and interest. They can get experimental down the road. So, for example, if poor people could be as targeted as Wall Street when they call out for help and Wall Street calls out for help, if the executive branch could be as creative in ensuring the reproduction of Wall Street as opposed to working people's plight, it's a very different world. Same would be true for the top tier in education. Unbelievable innovation at top tier education. When it comes to education, everyday working class and poor people, all of a sudden things go flat-footed, you see. You say, oh, wait, what's going on? When it comes to the Federal Reserve, providing interest-free loans month after month after month for 3.5 years, uncountable billions of dollars. And yet when it comes to student loans, you still got to pay interest. You still got to deal with hardship. See, the priorities are so warped that it's not a question so much of the non-existence of creativity, courage, and innovation. It's who is targeted, you see. And that's what, is so upsetting about so many of the so-called progressives when they get in office and they defer to Wall Street. Or when military elites say, we know you have no money, but we need uncountable billions because we're about to invade Iraq. We're about to occupy Afghanistan. We're about to drop some drones in Yemen and so forth. Money flows. But oh no, not Letitia and Jamal and Carlos and Juanita and Ishmael and Mohammed. Or John Sullivan in Appalachia. Or Susie McGillicuddy in South Boston, Irish working class. No, when it comes to them, all of a sudden, well, we've got some routines and we've got some procedures. Everybody must undergo, ... You see. Now, that's a very serious issue. Because at that point, you're really talking about will. You're talking about priorities. In light of the visions, in light of the need for structural transformations. But there has to be enough voices and enough people, enough organizations, enough churches and mosques and synagogues and temples and colleges and high schools organized enough to bring power and pressure to bear. When Barack Obama met with the Wall Street elites and said, I'm on your side, I stand between you and the pitchforks, don't worry, I will protect you. That's exactly the thing you say to poor people. That's what you say to working people. You don't have to say that to Wall Street. Wall Street's going to take care of itself. They've done it before. They'll do it again. You don't need help from the outside as politicians and organizations and so forth and so. Unless you're, an honest right-wing brother and sister, say, Brother West, Wall Street is a precondition for any democracy. If Wall Street goes under, all of American civilization goes under. You to be critical of Wall Street. Let's have an argument. Ain't nothing wrong with right-wing brothers and sisters got arguments. Let's engage. But the point is, we have to be clear about what's at stake, what the claims are, what the arguments are. And of course, that's again a matter of one's paper in this regard.
But in these remarks of yours, Cornell,
yes.
The crucial link is then the link between movement and program, right?
Right.
Because what has ordinarily happened in the United States is that when there is a movement, the movement has been relatively bereft of a structural program. So the left historically has had an idea of structural programs shaped by Marxism, which is there's a system, the capitalist system, the socialist system. So then there's this binary idea of politics. It's either a reformist management of a system or it's a revolutionary substitution of one system for another, excluding the real form of structural change, which is almost invariably piecemeal and fragmentary, but can nevertheless be radical in its outcome. And on the other hand, the dominant traditions of progressivism in the United States have been anti-structural. So we've discussed the two main traditions, the tradition of defending the little against the big, and then the tradition of accepting the predominance of big business, but regulating it by the powers of strong national government. Both of those traditions are deficient in structural imagination and ambition. And that's what we need now to solve these problems, like the problem that's just been alluded to. And then if this connection between movement and program is established, the aspiration to change the structure in a particular direction, step by step in every department of national life, then leads over time to a reinterpretation of the interests and the ideals in a solidaristic and transformative direction. So then you no longer think that there's some pre-established system that means that certain classes can't be allies. A concrete example, which we've discussed here, the political position of the small business class. The small business class is traditionally treated by the progressives as an opponent, like the European petty bourgeoisie, demonized by the European left. But it's absolutely crucial to the direction of the country. It has immense structural importance, and its sensibility, its attitudes, its ideas penetrate the whole country. So the question of the political position of the small business class is vital. And if you have a program of economic transformation, the conversion of mass production industry into an inclusive form of the knowledge economy, over time you begin to create a basis on which the working class majority can ally with the small business class. And that then becomes a tremendous political achievement that changes the entire correlation of forces in the country. It's an achievement then that has these two sides. The side of the strategy of creating a new alliance in the future, but then the programmatic side, because the precondition of the alliance is this structural project. The structural project is creating over time its own constituency. It's creating the institutional basis for this convergence of class interests that seem to be opposed, but that are not necessarily opposed. And all of those are a way of thinking that stands in opposition to what has been the main temper of American progressivism. The main temper of American progressivism is that everything is more or less obvious. It's the rich against the poor, the oppressors against the oppressed, the privileged against the downtrodden. There's no complication. There's no need for complicated ideas. There's no need for the imagination of alternative structures. And that's the illusion. That's the illusion which has vitiated the transformative power of American progressivism.
But do you think that the campaign of my dear brother Bernie Sanders was willing to embrace small business women and men, willing to embrace the petty bourgeoisie of all colors in his campaign?
I think it was so one has to distinguish two things. So one thing are the overt programmatic ideas.
Yes, yes.
The overt programmatic ideas, as far as I can tell, were mainly retrograde. That is, they look back to Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, to the second stage of Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal, antidotes to economic insecurity, entitlements. It was the old entitlement language of the second New Deal, the New Deal that produced Social Security. Very little in the programmatic ideas that had to do with empowerment, with a shared empowerment, shared economic empowerment through the cumulative transformation of the economy. No debate, for example, about what is vital, which is the advancement of the new practice of production, the knowledge economy, in an inclusive form. No discussion of how the market economy could be reshaped to change the relation of finance to the real economy. It's not just the regulation of finance, it's the enlistment of finance in the service of production. The real way to make finance less dangerous is to make it more useful. So if you looked at the movement in its actual words, in its programmatic proposals, yes, the campaign.
Yeah.
It was completely inadequate, and it looked backward. But a movement is not just its words. So then those inadequate words then become the catalyst for a convergence of people and an arousal of ambitions, of aspirations,
Absolutely.
of inquietude that is then capable of overcoming itself.
Absolutely.
But to do that, to go beyond those inadequate words, you need ideas. There's no way of circumventing the need for ideas. There's no amount of fervor that can dispense with the imperative of insight. And because in the end, we're all hostage to our understanding. And as the experience of reform in the 1930s demonstrated. And I think that's one of the main justifications for what we've tried to do here.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Do not hesitate. Yes. And then we go ahead.
People
Speak a little louder, please.
can give voice to their concerns or just their emotions. Like, really, it's just you feel anger, and for example, folk music or free jazz or things like that. The second phase is like awareness and like teaching about issues through music. And then the third would be like a call to action. I know we're really focused on institution building and like steps on how to like make this happen in reality. And I mean, I have some steps, like ideas like who would invest in, especially like young musicians, like at an early age to like who are from disadvantaged communities to be able to express like what's going on and then invest in providing music
No, that sounds like a fascinating paper. I mean, one of the sub-motifs of this class has been the way in which the history of arts in general and the history of music in particular are integral to any understanding of the history of American democracy. And the ways in which music has probably played a disproportionate role in terms of trying to accent the humanity of different peoples, black, white, red, yellow, and so forth and so on. I know a lot of people are breakdancing this very moment with Brother Kendrick Lamar, who went into Pulitzer. For damn, we got our dear brother from Compton here, Brother Elijah, who comes from the same community. And Elijah's a brilliant brother, and Kendrick's a brilliant brother. I have tremendous respect for Kendrick Lamar. I think he's one of the few geniuses working right now of his generation artistically. But I think there's a danger, you see, in the cultural superficial spectacle where things become much more about prizes rather than your substantive witness. You see, I think the last thing somebody wants is Kendrick Lamar, the Pulitzer Prize winner. No, you don't want that. You want Kendrick Lamar, the freedom fighter who's in a tradition that goes back to Gil Scott-Heron, that goes back to Curtis Mayfield, goes back to Nina Simone, and he happens to win the Pulitzer given by some white brothers and sisters in New York. Because he doesn't need a Pulitzer Prize for the richness of what he's doing. You see, Coltrane didn't need one. You see, Curtis Mayfield didn't need one. But it's good to have it because it gives you certain visibility. But that visibility can be a dangerous thing because it begins to eclipse what your vocation is. And that's why even on the ground when it comes to music, you don't become educated to certain musical forms in order to end up winning a prize. You become educated because it cultivates your soul, your courage, your vision in order to find your voice, to raise that voice, whatever prizes follow therefrom, or no prizes whatsoever. You see what I mean? And that's what part of the spiritual war on poor young people. They keep their music so thin and hollow and shallow and dumbed down, tied to stimulation and titillation, rather than courage and carrying and nurturing and visionary example, so that all they get exposed to is a certain kind of noise for body stimulation rather than music for soul cultivation. There's a very different ways of being in the world, and in that sense, it's paideia in sonic form, which is what this class is about. Paideia is deep education in oral form, and when you write your wonderful papers, in literary form. Right. But music's the same way. Same is true for dance. We got Fester Johnson and Brother John here, right? I got your first name right there, right, Brother John? Michael, I'm sorry, Brother Michael, because I'm telling you, you got a major contribution to make in the conversation we had the other day, and of course, Sister Jill has been magnificent in this regard. But it's a democratic mode of being in the world as artists. They happen to be dancers, they could be painters, they could be architects, they could be musicians or poets. But that's the tradition that has to be kept alive. When we talk about musical education, we talk about, especially for elementary, junior high school, then on to the college and university. Yes.
So an important theme, which has been mainly just in the background of the arguments of our course, should be brought out, is this. One of the commanding ideals here is this ideal of making ourselves collectively bigger, right? So a shared bigness, not a bigness that divides, not a bigness that's based on some dialectic of superiority and inferiority, of which, by the way, meritocracy is a variant, but a form of empowerment that's shared. So one of the attractions of the conception of an inclusive form of the knowledge economy is that it is such a shared form of empowerment. It disseminates the most productive form of production to a wide range of workers and firms. Now, in these existing societies and cultures, there is this phenomenon that we can label the privatization of the sublime. And that is one of the spiritual conditions of constraint, of belittlement. So the great forces that house our fantasies, our aspirations of adventure, of transcendence, of empowerment, are taken outside of prosaic everyday life. And they are in religion and in art, and they are treated then either as a matter for individual experience and conscience, as in the privatization of religion, or as an escape from the tenor of everyday life, as in the fantasies of adventure and empowerment in popular culture. So then there's a division of consciousness. Politics, then, real political and economic life, is the realm of cold efficiencies and equities, in which we can achieve advances only at the margin. And everything that represents a wilder aspiration is then treated as a fantasy, an escape, confined to the private conscience, separated from practical manifestation. So this is one of the fundamental spiritual bases of the situation with which we were engaging in the course. And the counterpart to these institutional transformations that have been our main subject matter has to be an attack on this division, an attack on the privatization of the sublime, an attack on the contrast between the cold efficiencies and equities in prosaic life and the wild fantasies in this world of escape of religious or artistic consciousness. They have to be joined together in some way. The sublime has to be deprivatized. And that's the, as it were, the artistic and religious program that is the indispensable counterpart to this project of cumulative institutional transformation. And I see all of these projects that several of the comments now have been about as going to that issue.
How to deprivatize.
How to deprivatize the sublime,
deprivatize
and to rejoin it to the public.
I know we had a hand here, we got a hand here, and a hand up here. So we got three. Go right ahead.
So for my project, I'm trying to develop a method of empirical science for studying social movements that seeks to enlist science in a project of ultimate liberation. I'm trying to liberate science from how we talk about it, the calling smartness and the neoliberal program. How can we do science in a way that actually
it sounds fascinating. I mean, the question of what is the relation between democratic experimentalism and scientific experimentalism. John Dewey draws a radical distinction between scientific method and scientific temper, because the scientific temper is anti-dogmatic, including scientific dogmas that tie them to one method, as if somehow that one method is the one key that opens the door to the ultimate nature of reality. So you can use scientific method in a dogmatic way to end up being radically unscientific. But scientific temper says that if you're going to be anti-dogmatic all the way down, then you have to be very experimental about any dogma that you have. See, that's jazz-like. That's Cecil Taylor, who just died. You see, any positing that you make is an experimental positing that can be called into question. So it doesn't have to be 12 bar, 18 bar. It could be 32. It could be 64. Or was Coltrane's Giant Steps, playing so fast you can't put the notes on the transcript. So what? I'm just getting out what's inside of me. You see, that's experimental. You shatter the orthodoxy. You see, and that scientific temper must be tied to evidence, inference, conclusion, premises made transparent, and so forth and so on. The kind of thing we get in the secular priesthood, which is the physicists, what the physicists do. That's our secular priesthood these days, right? They tell us the nature of reality. But they, at their best, have to be experimental all the way down. So in that sense, there's a connection between both kinds of experimentalism, but most importantly for me, the victims, those who are victimized by any dogma, have to have their voices heard. That's what democracy is also about. You can talk about Pope Francis all you want. Magnificent brother, concerned about the poor and so forth, but his institution is still patriarchal. Where are the voices of the women who are victimized by that in the processes of the Catholic Church? And I got a deep love for Pope Francis because he's dealing under constraints like anybody else. You see. But if you're a Democrat all the way down, small d, then you're going to be concerned about those who are victimized. The empire is the same way. They said, we're going to drop drone strikes. Let's hear from the families whose people are killed. Let's put their voices on television. Let's hear what they have to say. You might be convinced, you might not be convinced, but their voices ought to be heard. And that's true for any people who are victimized, no matter what sides we are in any controversy. Listen to the victims. They don't have a monopoly on truth, but you ought to hear their voices. Don't render their humanity invisible. Don't render their voices marginal. That's the democratic experimentalism. And that's what allows for elites at the top to engage in arbitrary power. You see what I mean? To do what they want to do and get away with it in the name of the law. It could be police engaged in abusing folk in working class and poor communities. No accountability. The voices of the folk who are victimized hardly given any weight, and the police walk free over and over and over again. It's not just a question of racial sensitivity. It's democratic accountability across the board. See, in that way, it takes us right to the heart of what we have been talking about in this class. Now, there was another hand right over here, this there, brother. Yes.
There is the question of many of us going back to the native traditions have had enormous experiences of life in connecting to the natural world.
Right.
And now this is something that whenever one of us tries to bring this up, it is said, oh, that is not a part of our economic world. The reaction to any close encounter with nature is, oh, that is outside of the economic world. That is outside of the world that we are concerned with. And I think that's exactly related to privatization of religion, it's related to the privatization of the arts, it's together, one category.
I mean, it's possible you can imagine to privatize your relation to nature, and you still fall in the same privatization problematic. But in terms of being open to the different kinds of encounters with nature of different cultures, different civilizations, especially your indigenous brothers and sisters. I mean, if they're not part of the conversation, then the conversation is parochial and provincial.
Nature as a whole is increasing part of the conversation. Metaverse work on just beautiful work. Somebody trained both in Western science and she's a member of the Citizen Potawatomi Nation, learn those traditions as well. But all of this is marginalized because people say it's outside the economy. Thereby it is outside the world.
Now, you're working on this in your paper? Oh, okay. That sounds good. That sounds good. That sounds good. But in the case, for example, of Standing Rock, where you get a slice of precious indigenous brothers and sisters who say, this land is sacred. This land is tied to the burial of our ancestors. This land is tied to the presence of spirits. Now, you see, if somebody were to mess with Mem Church like that, sacred land, precious spirits, protected, absolutely. Same is true for indigenous peoples.
Absolutely.
Yeah, nothing complicated about that. That's just double standards. Absolutely, absolutely. I'm not saying that's the only example, but that's a part of it. See, for the people who don't count, the people who don't matter, their sacred stuff doesn't matter either. You see.
That the way we value nature with ecological economics, where we say, okay, what we value is by adding up the money that something can give us. That is
Exactly.
to walk into the Sistine Chapel and say we're going to value it by the art.
That's right.
There's a Michelangelo on the ceiling, that's worth X. There's a Botticelli that took over there, that's worth X. And that is the way that makes culture.
It's more and more the mentality and orient. Absolutely. And see, in that case, I'm in deep solidarity. Pope Francis, we're going to protect Michelangelo.
Yes, and if you
Oh, yes, we are.
And if you tried that in Sistine Chapel, Pope Francis would come running and say, you can't do that.
For good reason.
For excellent.
Absolutely. No, we're going on this thing, but you. I saw some other hands somewhere. Where was it? I saw some other hands. What about some sisters? Wait, Peter, hold on. Any sisters? Oh, that's right. I promised you, and then we'll go to sisters. Go right ahead, Doctor. Thank you. Well, just very briefly, though, I've got deep libertarian sensibilities, which means that I want to defend freedom of expression, freedom of religion, free speech, and those freedoms usually result in voluntary associations of people forming mosques and synagogues and churches and temples and trade unions, even among graduate students and other slices of the working class. You see what I mean? And jazz clubs and hip-hop clubs and so forth. All of those must be protected in the name of not just rights and liberties, but most importantly, in the name of the cultivation of the kind of virtues and values that are requisite for allowing a democracy to survive. Sports teams, athletic activity, getting beyond your ego, learning what team spirit is, and surrendering your ego to something bigger than you. All of that contributes to a certain kind of way of being in the world that holds at arm's length certain kind of narcissisms and hedonisms. You see, there's no accident. I mean, the history of sports in the nation is very important in terms of dealing with white supremacy, male supremacy, and so forth and so on. You see, we made this point before. Right? For black people, up until the 1960s, the only space in the whole culture that was shot through with wholesale fairness was the boxing ring. So when Joe Louis and Muhammad Ali started knocking some white brothers out, because the rules were fair. As soon as they step out of the ring, unfairness everywhere. Same is true of the basketball court. Same is true of the football field. Fairness, justice, enacted in your everyday life. And then, lo and behold, people begin to think, oh, wow, when things are fair, and Jack Johnson is knocking out so-and-so in 1909, and there's massive race riots all across America. Negroes are killed after Jack Johnson wins. How come? Because that means when rules are fair, black folk might win. Ooh, Ku Klux Klan going to have an extra long meeting that night. Ooh, they're going to have an emergency session. Wow, you got structures of freedom and these Negroes are winning? Next thing you know, they want to come to Harvard. I mean, you all see the point. I'm being a bit facetious, you see. So that voluntary associations, I'm with the Tocqueville on this. But they have to be dynamic. They have to be changing over time. They have to be responding to the new technology, the new kinds of realities, the coming apart, the atomistic individualism that we'll be talking about right after this class of Brother Peter. Brother Peter, now, is there a sister who wanted to jump in before Brother Peter? Because we want to make sure we've got a precious woman's voices, but I'm not going to be coercive, so we're going to let it flow. There's my dear sister, go right ahead.
But wait a minute, but are we going to continue on the theme of voluntary association?
Well, it's up to you. I said what I had to say to my brother.
Peter, were you going to speak about voluntary association?
Did you want to say more?
Well, I think we should.
And then we'll come right to the sister right after.
Yeah,
Sure.
Is your comment about voluntary association? No, because
No, say more.
I think we should persist on this. It's a very important theme. It's a theme which is central to Tocqueville.
Oh, absolutely.
But central more generally to the American self-conception.
Oh, yes.
And most powerful current of conservative centrism, if we can call it that in the United States, is one that emphasizes voluntary association as the residual solution to the American problems. Now, the fundamental question is this. Voluntary association has no self-evident structure. So
Right.
what is its financial basis? What is its legal framework? So if we imagine that the market economy operates according to the existing regime of property and contract, according to its own dynamic, then there's the state, the government. What's voluntary association? A voluntary association is then the leftover. It's the residue. Whatever is not dealt with through politics or through the market is then dealt with through voluntary association. And what are the instruments for voluntary association? It's the existing apparatus of private law. The law of association is a derivative of the law of contract. And how is it financed? It's financed largely in the United States by the charitable deduction in the tax system, which turns voluntary association to a very large extent into an instrument by which the rich can pursue their hobbies, their social sympathies. So there is disconnect of a fundamental kind between the enormous importance that Americans give to voluntary association and its marginalization or fragility, both legally and financially. So now, what is most important to understand about voluntary association? What's important is this. A disorganized society cannot create alternative futures for itself and act on them. So the level of organization in society outside the state is crucial to the ability to create alternatives. That's what's important. And if that's our idea, then we should organize the legal and financial basis for this cooperative activity so that it can be really strong and not just this residue. So there's something wrong with the American idea about voluntary association. They're giving it all of this importance. They're treating it as having this salvational vocation, but they're not actually organizing it financially and legally so that it is central to their society. So how would we do that? Now, we've discussed some of the ways in which that can be done. For example, we say civil society should share with the government in the provision of public services. The state has an obligation to provide universal minima, but in the effort to go beyond those minima and to enhance the quality of public services, we want civil society to get into the activity and to be a partner with the state in the competitive and experimental provision of public services. That's not the privatization of public services in favor of profit-driven firms. It's this idea that there's a third sector beyond the state and beyond society, and it has to be organized, and it needs its own legal regime. And so the state has to then help finance civil society and prepare it, skill it, so that it can do this work. So another example then would be the organization of a principle of social service. Everyone in society should have some responsibility to take care of other people beyond the boundaries of his own family, beyond the boundaries of family selfishness. And there should be a universal principle of social service. Everyone exempted from military service should be subject to social service in some portion of his life or in some portion of the working. That's the real social cement. The real social cement is responsibility to help take care of other people. Money transfers organized by the state are not an adequate social cement. Then that service has to be organized legally. It has to be financed through public resources, but not controlled by the government. And it can take many different directions, so that people should have a wide latitude in the way in which they perform this social service responsibility. So those are just examples of how we would begin an agenda that starts to take voluntary association seriously. Now, the Americans say they take it seriously, but it seems that they don't, because they relegate it to this residual function. And our object in doing this is then to heighten the degree of self-organization in civil society outside the state, so that civil society then is capable of doing things, of creating alternatives. Or take yet another example, the problem of criminality, which is widely misunderstood in the whole world. So there are two different things. One is organized crime. Organized crime exists in a vacuum of governmental power.
Sometimes it exists in the government.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it involves it has to do with the state.
That's right. Okay.
And the attempt to disrupt the state
Yes.
or create an alternative to the state, like the mafia. in southern Italy is a rival for the power of the state. But episodic crime is completely different in its nature. So why is it that you have a country that they say is the result of poverty or inequality, but India is much poorer than Brazil, and in India, the level of episodic crime is much lower than the level of episodic crime in Brazil. Now, why is that? The answer seems to be that India is much more organized at the grassroots level, at the village level. But it's organized in the traditional so-called ascriptive forms, the religious organizations, the caste organizations. And we know that to the extent that society is organized, episodic crime goes way down. Because the self-organization of society results in transparency and in collective responsibility. Everyone is seeing what happens, and everyone is responsible for everyone else. Now, then we would want that level of organization in society at the grassroots level not to depend on these hierarchical and ascriptive organizations. So we would have to create an alternative basis for it. And that would be then another incident in the development of this agenda. So what I'm saying is this, that here in our programmatic arguments in the course, we have discussed the transformation of democratic politics and the transformation of the market economy. But there's a third domain. And the third domain is the transformation of civil society, of its self-organization. And that is a project. And it's not a project that takes care of itself by reliance on the traditional apparatus of private.
But I think one challenge, though, you have to come to terms with is the long-standing U.S. distrust of the state vis-a-vis civil society. There's the state as an instrument used by the powerful ethnic groups. If you're Jewish, if you're Muslim, if you're Baha'i, if you're Jehovah's Witness, these are groups that are small in number, and therefore the WAFs are going to have much more influence if the state plays a crucial role in shaping civic society.
But Cornell, this program for the creation, for the elevation of the level of self-organization in civil society is not a program of the government taking care of civil society.
No, but just...
Because here's a confusion, a very important confusion. It's the confusion of the state or the government with the law. So the law is not the state. That is, the civil association has to have a legal basis. It always has a legal basis. So now in the United States, it has a legal basis. The legal basis is existing private law. And existing private law radically skews and limits the degree of the self-organization of civil society. If I then propose, as I just proposed, a series of legal reforms to transform the character of the self-organization of civil society, that doesn't mean a governmental takeover of civil society. That means a contest over the legal framework of civil society outside the state. It's not that the state is taking over. This is exactly analogous to the debate that we have about the market economy. So the premise of conservative thinking, shared by the liberals, is that the market economy has a single, natural, and necessary form. And the form is the existing form. And then someone comes and proposes a series of innovations in the legal and institutional arrangements that define the market economy. Then the objection is going to be that suppresses the market. That's a form of governmental intervention in the market. It's not a form of governmental intervention in the market. It's a contest over what the market is. And if you assume that what the market is the form that it now has, then you see every attempt to change its form as a suppression of the market. But it's not a suppression of the market. It's a change in the character of the market. The same thing with civil society. And so the fundamental claim that I'm making is that the programmatic argument, our programmatic argument, has to now be extended to include this third domain. And that we have to, as it were, call the bluff on this American profession of faith in voluntary association. Are you really serious about it? If you're really serious about it, then let's do something about it. And to elevate the degree to which civil society in the United States is self-organized. Not organized by the government, organized by itself. But it can only be organized by itself if it has a task or a series of tasks, and if the performance of this task has a financial basis. Yes.
You know, I think that the single, what's apparent to me is that the single largest, the biggest threat to voluntary association is actually it's not governmental, it's economic. The expanding workday, or people having multiple jobs. I mean, if there's a certain budget of time that is necessary to participate in voluntary association, and voluntary associations compete with for-profit industries for the same resources, for time, attention, and money.
Yes.
And they're not, if they're not well managed, they're very susceptible.
Of course.
You know, I mean, think about it, you know.
So I agree with you entirely. And I think, the strengthening of voluntary association would then have as one of its auxiliary elements, as its counterpart, a series of changes in the labor laws that would facilitate the combination of paid work with this voluntary with this voluntary activity. Of course, but your observation about time calls to mind this enigma about the element of generosity, which is, as it were, the fuel of voluntary association. So here's a remarkable fact. Giving time is more important, more significant than giving money. Now, it appears from empirical study that there is a counterintuitive positive correlation between the number of children that people have and their willingness to give time in voluntary association. Now, how could that be? It seems to be a contradiction, because the more children you have, it seems the less time you have. But it turns out to be the case that the more children you have, the more likely you are to be willing to give time, and you do give time. So it's as if the human heart expands. Our time expands. So it's like the lump sum fallacy of labor in economics, according to which there's a fixed stock of labor. It has to be divided. There's a fixed stock of time. There isn't a fixed stock of time. The more we're engaged, miraculously, the more we have a disposition to engage and to connect. So that's a very hopeful element in the background of this organization of the project of voluntary association. So we have this potential. Let's take advantage of it. Let's organize it financially and institutionally. And that's then a great project for the country. And not allow voluntary association in its present conservative form to become a kind of alibi or excuse in which we say it's, as it were, the alternative to transformation. It's not the alternative to transformation. It's one more terrain for transformation.
Yeah. Well, we're going to have some fascinating papers. My dear sister right here.
So I have a question. I have like so many more questions now. So I one of the things that I was trying to say, like in Mexico, a lot of fields are required servicio social, which is like a year or two of just like essentially pro bono work. And I know that here we have to in law school we have to do I think 50 hours of pro bono work to graduate. But I guess it doesn't make any sense to me why that's not like a more widespread, like I mean because in Mexico I know that exists in medicine, it exists in law, it exists in all different types of fields. So my personal thought is that I think the United States, maybe this is just me being really cynical, but I think that there's a culture of selfishness in the United States, and sort of, just like you're saying, like time is money, and my time is my money, and like why should I share this? So maybe I just answer my own question, but I'm curious why don't we have servicio social or something similar, and what is the impediment to implementing it?
I think that's for a professor of law.
No, how so?
I'm just kidding. No, selfishness is a ubiquitous characteristic of the species. But cultures are different. There are certain cultures that put a premium on community and try to downplay the selfish proclivities that all human beings have. There's no doubt about that. De Tocqueville talks about that in terms of the ways in which certain kinds of selfishness are tied to loneliness, certain kind of selfishness spills over into a kind of self-referential altruism, tied to family, tied to community, tied to tribe, tied to people who look like you, and then on until it becomes the human family and sometimes even just sentient beings. So I think that, I don't know the legal culture. That's why I was making that joke about I don't know what the legal culture is in terms of the requirements of various lawyers in formation to try to have some commitment to something bigger than their own legal careers and their own pecuniary gains. But certainly, there's rich traditions in the United States of people committed to something bigger than themselves, public interests, common good. Isn't there public service law, public interest law? Does that have a presence at Harvard Law? Oh, that's what I'm talking about. Ralph Nader comes out of the Harvard Law School, doesn't he? Yes, doesn't he?
Yes, he does.
Oh, absolutely. He's an exemplar of preoccupation with public interest and common good in that way. But that's not an adequate answer to your question, though. Did you want to say a quick
Well, Cornell, this touches on the part of our arguments that had to do with the criticism of American ideals. And this conception that one of the taints on the message of the American prophets is that that figures like Emerson or William James still at the end of the day view this self-construction as if it were something that takes place within the individual. And then the individual, out of his generosity, remembers the others. That's the claim of solidarity. So but the fundamental view of self-construction is still the little Napoleon who crowns himself, but then remembers the imperative to be generous. But that's a false view of self-construction, because self-construction already at the outset involves connection, and the fundamental question then is, what forms of connection allow us to connect without being subjugated, without losing ourselves? These are what I call the higher forms of cooperation that have certain attributes, like the attribute that we'll be secure in a haven of vital safeguards, but all the rest of social life will be thrown open to contest and experiment. And all of the institutional proposals that we discussed in the course are in the way conjectures about the circumstantial form that those higher modes of cooperation could or should take in the present historical circumstance. But that is the counterpart to this criticism of the form of consciousness, in which we say this idea of self-construction has two taints. One of the taints is this false view of the relation between self-construction and solidarity, in which somehow solidarity is external to self-construction. It's not. And the other taint is then the reification, the mystification, the idolatry of the institutional arrangements, as if the idea of a free society had a natural form. What we were just talking about in voluntary association is an example of that. Voluntary association has a natural form. It doesn't. And a great democracy has to be able to challenge its own structure and to denounce and avoid this perversion of idolatry.
You know, there's a new book by Stephen Bush called William James and Democratic Individuality, which wrestles precisely with this complicated relation between self and solidarity, between the way individuals are constituted socially and historically, and the ways in which they don't lose themselves in community, but actually become constitutive of new communities over time. And when you look at essays by William James, like On a Certain Blindness in Human Beings, the classic text, The Moral Equivalent of War, he wrote right before he died, 1910. Classic text, wrestling with what Professor Unger is talking about, but he is complicated. At times he falls into the traps that Brother Roberto is talking about. Other times he's trying to get out. Brother Peter, you've been very patient. Go right ahead, man. You've been very...
One of the setting insights of this class seems to be that there's, we too often on the left think of the ideal society coming through some great revolution one day, we all take to the streets and it happens, it falls unified, but the insight Professor Unger has is that it often is through piecemeal reform, visionary reform, revolutionary reform. There seems to be a personality on the left of preparing for the revolution by preparing to be courageous. And so I actually, I'll take a heretical view, that I think our generation is ready to be courageous if there was a very clear moment. If someone said, you could save the world from climate change, but you have to die, I think many people would take the deal. I think many people would get on the bus now to be freedom riders. I think many people storm the airports when the travel ban went down. What revolutionary reform needs, though, are 50-year dedication, uncertainty, waiting through uncertainty, hour in, hour out, showing up to a meeting where there's 3 people there, and nothing's courageous about it. It's just the courage of being ridiculous. You know, it's the courage of being ridiculous year in, year out until it's not ridiculous anymore. How do you think we can train our generation, not just in the courage of when the Nazis come, you stand against them, but the courage of slowly building the institutions that are going to be needed to solve long-term problems? How do we supplement courage with dedication?
With dedication. It's a wonderful question, powerful. How would you answer your question before I try to answer?
I think moral education needs heroes that are not that exemplify it, and I think it's hard because Hollywood can do movies about courageous moments, but it's much harder to do a movie about 1,000 meetings. And if you can somehow figure out a way to show the dedication of 1,000 meetings in a fascinating way and substitute those heroes. So Peter, I'd just say that there's a feature of your description which makes the problem, threatens to make the problem seem insoluble, which is that you describe the experience as a sacrificial preparation of a future that has to be postponed. So the truth of what you say is
that in this work of transformation and self-transformation, you're either in it for the long haul or you're not in it, because that's the nature of a serious activity of this kind. But it seems to me that what's incomplete in your narrative is that you're not allowing for the way in which this future that is fought for can be anticipated in some way, that there's a foretaste of it, that there are tangible and fragmentary forms of it that can be established right now. Not necessarily in those meetings, but in what those meetings are designed to produce. And this seems to me to be an essential feature of political prophecy and of transformative practice. The prophet, in combining visionary teaching with exemplary action, has to be able to provide a down payment on the future that he envisions and promises. Everyone has to be able to touch the wound. There has to be something tangible that is the prenunciation of that alternative. Not just as an instrument of persuasive example, but as something that can, in fact, be lived, experienced, and then arouse a different form of emotion and experience. Otherwise, transformative practice becomes psychologically unbelievable, because we don't live in the future. Now, I've been accused here by my friend of being obsessed with futurity, but I think of living for the future as a way of living in the present, as a being who's not fully determined by the established circumstances of his existence. So, in accordance with the idea of radical reform and its fragmentary character, some element of the future has to be now. Sure. Because all we have is now. Our life is a series of nows. And we can't conceive of our lives as just instruments for the pursuit of a collective project in which we ourselves don't share.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I would agree with so much of that, but in the name of a dynamic tradition that contains the highest levels of moral and spiritual excellence, you can't have long-distance freedom fighters without the formation of mature attention. That's called revolutionary patience. Immature attention is push-button success, overnight victory. If I don't get it, I go home with my toys. That's called childishness. And part of the challenge of maturity is how do you preserve childlikeness, sense of awe, wonder, surrender to something bigger than you, and hold at arm's length childishness. I've said from the very beginning of this class, part of the problem in the United States is we've grown rich, we've grown powerful, we've grown wealthy, but we haven't grown up. That's what it is to be addicted to innocence. You're scared of experience. There's no maturity without experience. The formation of mature attention is going to those meetings, finding joy in those meetings without having to have the pleasure of the spotlight. You see, it is the cultivation of a mature self that can engage in forms of self-criticism and self-scrutiny without resulting in spectatorial cynicism or paralyzing skepticism, being skeptical about skepticism we talked about before. That's what criticism is. Maturity. Now, one of the reasons why Brother Roberto and I struggle over this relation between past and present, because he says over and over again, he doesn't want the dead to, how do you put it, dominate the living? Or
I don't want the living to be ruled by the dead, to be
living
governed
to be
by
ruled
the dead.
Exactly, and I love that, but it's only partly right.
And it says in the gospel, let the dead bury the dead, right?
Yeah, but everything in the gospel not to be
relative. Yes. Yes.
No, but you see,
it's related to the command to be in the world without being of it.
Exactly, in it but not of it, tied to novelty. But you
Yeah.
see, I'm thoroughly convinced, based on my experience, that much of the best people are dead.
The vast majority of them.
No, but I'm talking about the best of the past. You don't see no Shakespeare's and Melvilles. You don't see no Donny Hathaway. You don't see no Curtis Mayfield. You don't see no Coltrane's. You don't. The best, set the highest. There's no Louis Armstrongs alive. There's no Billie Holiday's alive. Sorry, Beyonce. There's no Sarah Vaughan's alive. The best are in the past. Which means what? If those dead dominated the present, we would be so much more alive. Which means that the highest standards of excellence is to be found in part, not exclusively, in part among the dead. The voices of the dead. Cecil Taylor just died. He's one of the great exemplars of excellence. Nobody plays the piano like him right now alive. 89 years old. What does that mean? What that means then, maturity requires deep connection with the best of the past. So you get the formation of a mature attention, revolutionary patience, formation of mature self-criticism without self-righteousness, and the formation of a surrendering, service-oriented self. We've talked in this class about Brother Martin almost every week, 50 years now gone. One of the distinctive features when you look on the American landscape of leadership is go from Martin Luther King Jr. to most American leadership. What is that? A major drop. Unbelievable drop. Every color, every gender. What has happened? That's decline. That's spiritual decline. That's moral decline. And that's not to say he's a deity or a god, but it's to say we have to come to terms with why it is that people have this momentary sense of heroism and don't have the long distance marathon orientation of, as persons with biographical time, we're going to give all that we can. Now, what was distinctive about the great ones of the past was kenosis. They started with their cup full and they ended with their cup empty. When they put Martin in the grave, the doctor said he was 65 years old. He was only 39 biologically, but he was 65 years old. He gave everything. Charlie Parker, the same way at 34 years old. We can go on and on and on in this regard. How do we generate a generation of young people who fundamentally believe in kenosis, who give everything, cultivate their gifts, not to have the spotlight brought to bear on just how gifted they are, but to use those gifts in service to the vulnerable? That's a spiritual and moral issue at its deepest level. And one of the best examples, we only got 2.5 more minutes. My dear brother, Professor Unger, after over 40-some years of teaching at Harvard Law School, is on fire in the same way now as he was when I saw him at 25 years old. When I saw him at 25 years old, I'm true. I saw him at 25 years old. I said, there's no way under God's heaven this brother's going to stay on fire like this. He's got to run out of gas sooner or later. And here he is now at 70 years old, still giving of himself. That's a beautiful thing. Not because he's a deity or a god. We know he could be wrong sometimes. But it's because he's undergone a spiritual and moral maturation that is manifesting an intellectual vocation that's preoccupied with visions as it connects to the weak and the vulnerable, poor and working people. Brazil, here, India, across the board. And that is examples, and it's only by means of examples. Examples are the go-kart of judgment. It's only by examples that you get a sense of what it is to be in the world with your own vocation, your own calling, your own revolutionary patience, your own maturity, your own courage, your own fortitude, your own willingness to serve and surrender and to give and empty of oneself. And most importantly, to find joy in it. Because if you don't find joy in it, you're not going to be a long-distance runner. But if you've only cultivated the capacity for pleasure and you don't know what joy is, then you never end up knowing what love is. And if you end up not knowing what love is, you're never really alive. You're just in space and time, existing with titillation and stimulation. And that, again, is a moral and spiritual issue. No religious tradition has a monopoly on it. Judaism, Christianity, Buddhism, Hinduism, atheism, none of them have a monopoly on it. But if you don't cultivate the capacity to love truth, goodness, beauty, cultivate the capacity to find joy in connecting to something bigger than you, then you never really had a deep sense of what it is to be human, because you're not here that long. You're never able to wrestle with the deeper questions of what the good life is all about. And that's in part what this class has been about. We got about 20 seconds. Any last.
It's over, Cornell.
Is it over?
It's over.